We don't enjoy our rights because the state has decided to grant them to us. It's not within the gift of the state to suddenly withdraw those rights. We enjoy those rights by default. And if the state is going to suspend them, the burden of proof is on the state to demonstrate to us that it is an absolute necessity to suspend those rights in these circumstances.
Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by Toby Young, a leading UK journalist and the founder of the British Free Speech Union. Toby is an associate editor of The Spectator magazine and a former associate editor of Eliot, and has written for many of the UK's leading newspapers. In 2021, Toby was awarded the Contrarian Prize for his contribution to nonconformist thinking in Britain. The prize recognises individuals who have demonstrated independence, courage and sacrifice through their ideas and actions. And now I give you Toby Young. Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue, Toby.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining me today. You've come a long way.
I have, yeah. I've just about adjusted to the time difference now.
Yeah, good. Now, you started the British Free Speech Union. Now, free speech is nested in liberty. So what is liberty and what's the state of it in the West and in particular Britain? Because that's what you know most about, I imagine.
Yes. What is liberty? Well, I think of liberty as negative liberty, as distinguished from positive liberty by Isaiah Berlin, which means freedom from rather than freedom to. And I think of it as freedom from interference by various authorities, from your behaviour and speech being circumscribed by various authorities. It's in a pretty parlous state across the Western world. Obviously, it's never been in a great state in other parts of the world. I've just been reading a book called The Demon in Democracy by a Polish political scientist. I won't try and pronounce his name. But he talks about the uncanny similarities between certain aspects of the communist system that was overthrown in 1989 in Eastern and Central Europe and in Russia, and the liberal democratic system that's replaced it. And in particular, a kind of, one of the similarities is a kind of utopianism, a belief in the perfectibility of human society, and that history is marching in a particular direction and has an end point which we are approaching. And that leads to a kind of unwillingness to tolerate dissent and treating people who don't share that point of view and don't value the supposed end point of this great march of history, to treating them as sort of beyond the pale and not worth debating with. And it certainly seems to be the case if you look at the responses to the pandemic across the English-speaking world, across the West more generally. And if you look at various illiberal measures taken by supposedly liberal governments here in Australia, in Canada, in the UK, in America, that there has been quite a significant departure from some of the liberties we think of as fundamental to liberal democracy. To a certain extent they were temporary, and those liberties have now largely been restored. But the speed, the willingness to suspend those basic liberties by various governments, and the willingness on the part of populations in Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia to accept those encroachments on their liberties was quite shocking. And I worry that having discovered that they can get away with it, various Western governments will behave equally illiberally in response to another pandemic, or as a way of addressing other supposed existential crises such as climate change. I guess one of the essential liberties which seems to be under threat across the Western world is the right to free speech, and that's it's and this book I've just been reading is very insightful on this particular point. One of the reasons we upheld free speech, one of the reasons it became such an important liberal norm, is that we had this conception of the state as being neutral between various different conceptions of the good, and being the kind of referee, the keeper of the ring, the preserver of neutrality with respect to various competing conceptions of the good. And free speech was important because it enabled people to explore and articulate what they thought of as a good life. And the state felt it had no right to intervene and silence people promoting their particular conception of the good, provided they weren't actually encroaching on the liberties of others. And I think, to use Mill's metaphor, the state was sort of almost like a gardener, cultivating the environment within which these different plants could thrive. And we seem to have resiled from that position. And now there are many more conceptions of the good that have been ruled impermissible. And that, I think, has eroded the commitment to free speech within various liberal democracies across the world. There are just certain forms of life, certain conceptions of the good, which are now just considered beyond the pale, no longer defensible.
Well, they're considered bad.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so political leaders, institutions, even some newspapers and broadcasters don't think they have any kind of obligation to allow people promoting these particular conceptions of the good to kind of participate in public life, to contribute to public debate. And the argument is often that if you allow, say, Orthodox Christians to promote a conventional Orthodox Christian view about marriage, which rules out gay marriage, that's considered not only a kind of illegitimate view, which is completely at odds with the kind of inclusivity of modern societies, but actually potentially harmful to a vulnerable group. It could lead to violent assaults on gay people. And the same argument is made to try and shut down any criticism of, trans rights orthodoxy. That if you allow people like Kelly J. Keane to challenge that orthodoxy in the public square, that will lead to violent attacks on trans people. So there's in the name of, preventing harm, it's almost an invocation of Mill's harm principle. We're going to silence these dissenting, unorthodox voices. But that often feels like, a rhetorical smokescreen for what's really going on, which is just an intolerance of people challenging values that are now considered sacred in the way liberal democratic societies have evolved. One thing that's become apparent since the attacks on southern Israel on October 7th and the subsequent wave of pro-Palestinian protests across the West is that this concern for the impact of certain forms of speech on the well-being, the safety of religious minorities, vulnerable populations, historically disadvantaged groups is quite selective and doesn't seem to apply to Jews. You know, if the authorities really do, if their real reason for stopping, Don Brash from speaking at the University of Victoria is because it might lead to violent attacks on Maori students, or it might undermine their mental health in some way, make them feel traumatized and vulnerable and at risk, and
unwelcome,
and might therefore lead to underperformance in examinations and so forth. The usual arguments made. Well, if they really believed that, if that was their real reason for stopping Don Brash from speaking, and not because they just profoundly disagree with what he has to say, then why don't they stop? Why aren't they much more energetic about suppressing pro-Palestinian protests at the University of Victoria and protesters chanting from the river to the sea? So it seems like what's really going on is that institutions, organizations, public authorities, political actors, their conception of what is an acceptable version of the good life to pursue, and their conception of what is a good society, has become much narrower as liberal democracy has evolved since 1989. And so it's taken on some of the totalitarian characteristics of the system it triumphed over in 89. And one of those is a kind of intolerance of dissent when it comes to challenging what has become this much narrower conception of what a good society is.
Right. Can we just go back a step? What is liberalism? And are these forces that you're talking about illiberal?
Well, I remember, as a graduate student, studying the communitarian critique of liberalism. And part of the communitarian critique was that when liberals claim to be neutral with respect to competing conceptions of the good and just the keepers of the ring, they're being dishonest, because there are always going to be some conceptions of what a good life looks like that are going to be unacceptable, even in a fairly light touch, minimal state liberal society. So liberals need to be more honest about what kind of values they're actually defending and what they're ruling out of bounds, and not just pretend, not take responsibility for defending a particular way of life, and pretend that they're just neutral. And I think that there's definitely something in that, but it's more that what was considered beyond the pale as recently as 25 years ago, that kind of category has become much enlarged over the past 15 years or so.
Yeah. So the Overton window has actually contracted substantially.
Yes. The Overton window of what is an acceptable point of view, way of life, political philosophy to espouse in a liberal democracy, that has become much narrower.
But if what are the sort of core principles of liberalism?
Well, I suppose apart from free speech, I think of the rule of law as being a core characteristic of a liberal society, representative government, democracy, guarantees of certain fundamental human rights.
And so these forces are liberal? If someone is anti-free speech, is that a liberal position?
I think it is illiberal, although confusingly, the rationale for suppressing free speech and for silencing certain dissident voices, the rationale for breaching what we have always thought of as sacrosanct liberal norms is often to preserve liberal democracy. So in Europe, for instance, I fear that the response within the kind of corridors of power in the EU to the various victories of populist insurgent parties in the European elections a couple of weeks ago will be to double down on censorship, and they'll be doing it not because they don't want to be burdened with having to defend globalization, mass immigration, freedom of movement in the public square, because they've been losing that argument. They'll be doing it in the name of preserving liberal democracy. They'll say these populist insurgent parties are essentially fascistic in nature.
They're anti-democratic.
They're anti-democratic.
Threat to the liberal
order.
They
threaten our way of life.
Yeah.
A threat to the liberal order. And so in the name of preserving liberal democracy, we're going to have to act in an illiberal, undemocratic way.
Yeah, so it's a Pyrrhic victory, isn't it? In order to quash the enemy, we have to act like the enemy.
Yes, and of course the concern is, and you can see this in Poland's probably the most stark example, where Donald Tusk is the prime minister, really passing various laws to make it really difficult for his political opponents to operate, shutting down newspapers, television stations, banning them from serving on the Supreme Court, and so on and so forth. And all in the name of preserving liberal democracy. But as you say, you can imagine, liberal democracy being destroyed by these so-called guardians of liberal democracy in the name of preserving it.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what's happening. That seems to be the direction of travel, certainly in Europe.
Yeah. So, freedom of speech in the West is a core fundamental value, isn't it? It's sort of, in a sense, what our societies have been built on, mm-hmm. the ability to go against the dominant narrative. And are you saying that is, under serious risk at the moment in the West?
Yes, it does seem to be under serious threat. And curiously, the threats often take the same form. So the hate crime bill that the last government in New Zealand tried to introduce, but were obstructed by the New Zealand Free Speech Union, amongst others, was very similar to the Hate Crime Act that's been passed in Scotland. Very similar to prohibitions, included prohibitions on so-called hate speech that have been embedded in various domestic laws across the European Union, quite similar to the bill that's currently going through the Irish Parliament. And again, attempts to police social media to cleanse social media of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech as a way of preserving democracy and protecting vulnerable groups from attack and so forth. Remarkably similar, the effort here, again obstructed by the New Zealand Free Speech Union, remarkably similar to the Online Safety Act that's passed in the UK, to the Digital Services Act, which was passed in the EU, quite similar to the Act which recently passed in Australia and led to the creation of the E-Safety Commission. So it's as though there is a kind of coordinated attack on free speech across the world. And often, if you look behind these legislative initiatives, there do seem to be some coordinating bodies, particular.
Such as what?
Well, the UN, for instance, has been very energetic in promoting legislative restrictions on what people can say on social media. The WHO talked about the infodemic being as great a threat to the safety of mankind as the COVID pandemic. Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, two American journalists who were involved in the Twitter files, they refer to this global, coordinated, multi-agency effort to suppress free speech as the censorship industrial complex.
Yeah.
And
just in case anyone doesn't know, just tell people what the Twitter files.
So the Twitter files were when Elon Musk bought Twitter. He then looked in the kind of environs of the company and discovered that actually there was a systematic, coordinated effort by people at Twitter doing the bidding of various government agencies as well as senior academics to suppress various forms of speech, such as, the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Right. Yeah. Well,
then all this information was then released into the public domain, and kind of that release was curated by various journalists like Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, etc.
I was going to ask you further down, but we'll rip into it now. Are governments outsourcing their censorship proclivities to these private organisations such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, etc.?
Yeah, that's quite sinister. It's
censorship by proxy.
Censorship by proxy, yeah. And what was I think the shocking thing about the Twitter files wasn't that the federal government was applying pressure on Twitter to censor dissenting points of view which challenge the authority of the federal government. Of course, you'd expect politicians to behave in self-interested ways and to try and suppress criticism. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. And of course, there are various laws circumscribing their ability to do that, which they were trying to get around in a potentially, illegal way. But what was shocking wasn't politicians behaving like politicians. What was shocking was the willingness of the senior executives at Twitter to comply with these demands. And it was as though they were sort of co-opted by the authorities into this kind of conspiracy in the name of defending the public from misinformation and disinformation and hate speech. And I think one of the kind of unwelcome trends of the past 15 years has been the alignment of senior journalists and executives at social media companies with the authorities. We really came into sharp relief during the pandemic. Journalists who really should have been challenging the authorities' response to the pandemic and asking whether all the measures that were being taken were really necessary, were really warranted by the data. Instead of doing that, they just went along with it. They just saw themselves as being part of the establishment. They're
on the same team, essentially.
They're on the same team, yeah.
So there is a word for that. It's called propaganda, isn't it?
Yeah, and they seemingly kind of were completely untroubled by being enlisted in this propaganda.
So they're not actually journalists in a sense.
Yeah, well, it was. I think they felt like. I think the way they justified it to themselves was that it's almost like wartime, and we have a duty to our country to act in what we've been told and we've been persuaded is in the country's best interest, and that means suspending the norms that would usually apply.
Is that a valid stance? I mean, it was an extreme situation. We didn't know how bad it was going to be. 2020 hindsight vision. It's easy to say this now, but if it was, the same as Ebola, can the liberal order be sustained in those situations? I mean, you mentioned wartime.
Yeah.
In war, I can't get up on a soapbox and say anything I want.
Yes.
So we've had this before. So how do liberal democracies get around that problem?
My kind of uncompromising view is that we don't enjoy our rights, because the state has decided to grant them to us. It's not within the gift of the state to suddenly withdraw those rights. We enjoy those rights by default. And if the state is going to suspend them, the burden of proof is on the state to demonstrate to us that it is an absolute necessity to suspend those rights in these circumstances. Now, I think if you're under attack by an aggressive foreign power, then maybe that burden's been met. But I think if you're dealing with an unknown virus, no, that burden hasn't been met.
Right.
To my mind, I was never persuaded that the drastic measures the British government was taking, which involved a suspension of our liberties on a hitherto unprecedented scale, like nothing like that has ever been done in Britain before, even during wartime.
House arrest, mass house arrest, essentially.
House arrest. Yeah, and it seems to me that the state had not proved, certainly not to my satisfaction, that was necessary in order to protect the public from this unknown virus. And of course, it proved to be unnecessary with hindsight. But to my mind, you didn't need the hindsight in order to see that it was wrong.
Yeah. So there needs to be a very high bar.
Yeah. And then, I mean, one of the reasons I think Sweden didn't lock down in 2020 is because there are various constitutional protections.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask. How do you enshrine those? So you have that in the Constitution. Just talk more about that.
Well, yeah, I think in the Swedish Prime Minister didn't have the power within the Swedish political system to introduce a lockdown, place the citizenry under house arrest, force businesses to close, without the sign-off of the head of the kind of public health authority. And he was unwilling to sign it off.
Right.
So it was sort of a limitation, I suppose, on parliamentary sovereignty,
right.
Which we don't enjoy in the UK. I mean, there are various, and generally I'd be an advocate of parliamentary sovereignty, but there are various legal protections of our rights. But whenever anyone tried to challenge the various aspects of the lockdown policy in the courts, they were unsuccessful, including the UK Free Speech Union. So
right.
Ofcom, the broadcast regulator, issued various guidance notes when Britain did lock down, urging licensed broadcasters to exercise extreme caution when allowing critics of the pandemic response airtime, and to subject them to particular scrutiny, and letting broadcasters know that Ofcom would be keeping a beady eye, a very close eye on them when they allowed critics of the public authorities' pandemic response onto the airwaves. And the effect of that was to mean almost no critics got on the airwaves. And we challenged that and claimed that it was a breach of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees freedom of expression, which has been incorporated into British law by the Human Rights Act. And we got nowhere. the courts generally were not great at defending our liberties when people tried to appeal to them to defend them.
Yeah, so in a sense, our liberties are paper thin. They can evaporate.
Yeah, in a so-called emergency, but then
yes.
There's always an emergency. The judiciary, which is supposed to be a check on the overreach of the government, just as the Fourth Estate is, were kind of co-opted by the authorities in much the same way that journalists and broadcasters were co-opted by the authorities. And these things we'd thought of as guarantors of our liberty weren't.
Right. And just going back to Sweden, just in case people don't know. So Sweden didn't lock down, and did they suffer grave consequences in comparison to, say, Britain?
No. The kind of commonly accepted way of measuring the impact of the pandemic is to look at excess deaths. And in Sweden, they had one of the lowest, if not the lowest, level of excess deaths during the pandemic in Europe. And yet they were the only European country not to lock down in 2020. So that seems to me to be pretty... I mean, of course, people will quibble with that and they'll say that Sweden's exceptional, and they'll point to other Scandinavian countries which did lock down and also had very low excess deaths, like Norway, Finland. But to my mind, that shows that the lockdown made zero impact on mitigating the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah, it just shows that given a certain set of circumstances, we're all very compliant.
Yes. Yeah, I'd imagined before witnessing the reaction of the British public to the first lockdown that Nazism could never take root in Britain. That we valued our liberty too highly. We were immune to being swept up in these kind of illiberal political movements. As George Orwell said, if someone tried to goose step down a British high street, people would just burst out laughing. Yeah. We are a nation of kind of independent-minded shopkeepers, constantly blowing raspberries at the authorities. It turned out, no, we were as compliant as the rest of the European population was, as the populations of Australia and New Zealand were. I mean, I was disappointed by the reaction, of Australians, how quickly they complied, and how, one thing we saw in the UK, I think you saw it in Australia too, was the willingness of the general public to become enforcers of the lockdown policy, to dob in their neighbours if they breached the rules. It was the extraordinary kind of willingness of ordinary people to align themselves with the unbelievably overbearing illiberal authorities to try and punish their kind of more freedom-loving neighbours. I mean, it was just shocking, and of course it brought home the fact that that actually Nazism could have taken root in Britain probably just as easily.
Yeah, we're just like everyone else.
Yeah,
we're nothing special in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, someone explained to me in the case of Australia, you'd thought of Australians as being descended, the Australians of European ancestry, of being descended from convicts and being kind of freedom-loving, ornery individualists. But actually, the way to think of it is think of them as a nation descended from what's the word? Prison wardens.
Yeah. So John Stuart Mill said sort of one of the biggest risks to freedom of speech is from our fellow citizens. Was he right? And in a sense, he's talking about if there's a zeitgeist which is against, where there's a dominant narrative.
Yes.
And 99% of the people believe it. 90%. Yeah.
Yes.
It's difficult. It's the 1% will not be allowed to speak freely.
Yes.
And they were being forced by, all our friends and family.
Yes.
And loved ones.
Yes. Yeah, and I think he one of the reasons he prized free speech is because he was worried that there was this tendency in democratic societies to suppress kind of minority points of view and to penalize eccentricity. And he had this kind of romantic view that a nation was enriched by, eccentric inventors and poets and artists, and they'd be under threat in a kind of evolved democratic society. And de Tocqueville warned of the same thing in Democracy in America, the tyranny of the majority. And I think to a great extent, their fears, writing in the 19th century, were misplaced. Urbanization meant that people could, in outside, the small town, heavily policed, kind of repressed environment, kind of indulge in alternative ways of life, could pursue their artistic passions, could engage in sexually deviant behavior, and within cities there were always areas which became kind of enclaves of kind of of freedom.
That's one of the reasons people go to cities.
One of the reasons people leave their small towns and go to cities, of course.
Yeah.
But seemingly the dangers they identified have resurfaced with the advent of social media. Now it's as though we're all living in Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, in which we're being kind of monitored all the time.
I agree.
By our neighbours, by people we're passing on the street. So you can no longer kind of find those kind of oases of freedom in big cities anymore, and the tyranny of the majority has kind of resurfaced as a huge threat to dissenting points of view, to eccentric behaviour, with the advent of social media. I mean, I think it's things have improved slightly since Elon Musk bought X, as he now calls it.
Yeah,
it's no longer being used in quite the same way as a kind of tool of.
Talk about that, because a lot of people tell me that it's substantially worse since Elon bought it.
By worse, what they mean is that points of view that were suppressed by the previous owners are no longer suppressed. Points of view that they think should be suppressed because they think pose a danger to the public safety.
Right.
But it's become. I mean, when Twitter was first created, it was described by its creator as the free speech wing of the free speech party. And when Apple, was there was that famous ad, in which Big Brother was destroyed by Apple, and it was thought to be this great kind of tool of liberation and freedom.
Well, Silicon Valley was libertarian.
Yeah, not anymore. And Twitter became, I think, not only did social media become the kind of vector of the transmission of the woke mind virus, which is why I think it's kind of worse in the English-speaking world, why the woke religion has quickly become established as the kind of public orthodoxy across the English-speaking world. It's because social media has been the vector of transmitting this kind of mind virus, and English is the first language of social media. Cancel culture seemed to kind of emerge alongside the kind of explosion of smartphones and social media around the midpoint of the 2010s.
Yeah.
And Twitter became the primary enforcement mechanism. The way in which people were cancelled. Certainly it was the way I was cancelled back in 2018. And I think that has changed a little bit since Elon Musk bought it.
Right. Well, going back to my comment about what John Stuart Mill said about, it's our society that's going to be a repressive force. I mean, I use the term being burnt at the digital stake.
Mm-hmm.
which is what social media allows us to do.
Mm-hmm.
It weaponizes the citizens to
Yes.
go against and ostracize
Yes.
particular individuals.
Although to complicate things slightly, we're not actually talking about a majority tyrannizing
Exactly.
a kind of heretical minority. We're talking about a noisy minority
Yeah.
kind of tyrannizing the majority.
Yeah. Well, I did a podcast last year on the cancellation of Meg Smaker and her film, The
Yes.
UnRedacted, which is formerly
Yeah.
Jihad Rehab. And that is a fascinating case of how quickly and how, Sundance apologised after showing the film, after a small group of people got on Twitter. And then there was a cascade of cancellations from every other top flight film festival in the
Yes.
world,
Yeah.
except for, I can proudly say this, Dock Edge Film Festival in New Zealand,
Great.
which proudly showed it
Right.
to a very enthusiastic audience. And if you listen to my podcast, I'll link it in the show notes. The Dock Edge director Alex Lee was just basically, no, we're not caving into the bullies, and which was a very rare but very inspiring scenario. But so I was going to lead on to sort of the media. So you've had your whole career has been a journalist, and you've worked at many top flight media institutions in Britain. And what is the state of the media? And possibly can you talk about the process that led to your cancellation in 2018, and how the media facilitated that in a sense. So let's start with the state of the media, and then maybe lead into that story.
Well, the British media is, I'd say, in a pretty parlous state. It hasn't worked out how to sustain itself. Mainstream legacy brands like The Guardian, like the BBC.
So their financial model is collapsing.
Yeah, their financial model is collapsing. I mean, the BBC, is subsidised by the taxpayer, but it's not clear that can last indefinitely, given how few people actually watch the BBC now compared to Netflix and Amazon Prime and the rest of it. But they haven't yet developed a successful, sustainable commercial model to replace the one that's been undermined by the internet. And it looks as though there's going to be a kind of winnowing. There already has been a winnowing, but it looks as though it'll continue. And that sort of coincided with a collapse of trust in the mainstream media and the emergence of a kind of alternative media ecology.
Well, like what we're doing here.
Yeah. And, Substack and various news publishing sites. The one I produce, The Daily Skeptic. And legacy media brands are just hemorrhaging, eyeballs and ears to these.
And I would also say talent, probably.
And talent,
in terms of the quality of the individuals becoming journalists.
Yes. So I'd say that the alt media, for want of a better phrase, is extremely healthy in the UK. I mean, it's sort of this alternative media ecology has emerged in the past 5 years or so, which is incredibly healthy and interesting and full of, talented people. But the legacy media seems to be almost in its death throes. And, maybe that's not such a terrible thing. I mean, the one of the reasons the legacy media is sanguine about various assaults on free speech by the censorship industrial complex is because the censorship industrial complex has been quite careful to exclude the mainstream media from its kind of censorship efforts. And they often say, we're just trying to protect your brands from being assailed by these alt media organizations which claim to be telling the truth when actually they're misinforming the public. and it's sort of like that. There's a kind of appalling kind of overlap of interest between the legacy mainstream media and the censorship industrial complex. They think it's going to preserve their lives for a little bit longer.
Yeah, that makes sense to what we were talking about before, about why the media is so enamored with doing the bidding of higher powers.
Yeah, they think that things like the in Britain, the Online Safety Act, in Canada, the Online Harms Bill, they think that will protect their brands from competition, which they're currently, losing to.
I recently interviewed Jonathan Rauch, and his book, The Constitution of Knowledge. Have you read that?
I have, yes.
And would you agree with his premise that knowledge is created by essentially a network of institutions, rather than just individuals by themselves coming up with great ideas? And he puts a big focus on the media. I mean, he's a journalist himself, and I personally agree with him in many respects. But what happens when one of the nodes in this network becomes corrupted or suffers from just normal entropy?
Yes, I think
so. In particular, the media.
Yes, I think that is a problem, and universities and scientific journals, the custodians of knowledge production, have in many cases been captured by this rather kind of narrow radical progressive ideology. And that creates a problem too, and also creates space for people outside those institutions to participate in knowledge production. And of course, that brings all sorts of problems with it. But the way to address that problem is to make the existing keepers of the ring a little bit less censorious, and to try and decouple them from this kind of rather narrow ideology. I mean, it's interesting the way in which science, like the media, like the courts, was co-opted by the authorities during the pandemic. Again, the willingness of scientists to be co-opted was a shock. There was a kind of lack of independent mindedness, a lack of kind of regard for what I think of as the scientific method, and a willingness to go along with politicians saying that their actions were being dictated by the science, as though science can, in an uncomplicated way, just dictate public policy. That was also shocking, and I think corresponding with the loss of public trust in the media has been a loss of public trust in science. This sense that it's sort of politically biased, that it's on one side in the culture war, and it's suppressing, papers and research which seem to challenge narrow ideological view.
They just needed a better PR company, because what they should have said was, this is what we think at the moment. It could change. We don't know. This is a moving target, rather than claiming upon high, this is exactly how it is, and then suppressing other voices. Who is Harry Miller?
Harry Miller is an ex-policeman who is also gender critical, and I think
can you just say what gender critical means?
So he believes in the biological reality of sex, and doesn't think that trans women are women.
A shocking belief.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a caricature of what the other side believe, or rather, maybe it's stacking the deck against them. But anyway, so he got into trouble for publishing a kind of scatological verse on Twitter, I think in 2019, and he was investigated by Humberside police.
What did he say?
It was. I can't remember. It wasn't.
Roughly.
People describe it as a limerick, but it wasn't actually a limerick. It was just a kind of comic verse about a man who identifies as a woman coming a cropper. I can't remember exactly, but you can look it up.
Right.
But I haven't committed it to memory. It wasn't particularly funny or well written,
Yeah.
and I don't think he composed it himself. I think it was just he was just kind of repeating it.
Yeah.
Supposedly a Humberside police officer told him he would have to, came and investigated him at his place of work. Someone reported him. He was placed under investigation. He was told by this officer to check his thinking. And it was recorded as a non-crime hate incident in Humberside's database. And Harry wasn't going to take this lying down, and he challenged both Humberside Police and the College of Policing, which is a quango, an arm's length body, which oversees the police in England and Wales. It was created by the coalition government in 2014, and the College of Policing.
It's not the group that trains policemen.
Yeah, it is responsible for education and training.
Okay,
Yes,
right,
amongst other things.
right.
And it came up with this concept of a non-crime hate incident in 2014.
Just it's Orwellian.
It's
in the
Orwellian.
extreme.
Yeah, I mean, they could have come up with better language to describe it. I think that
Sort of like, where's my 1984?
yeah, just extraordinarily.
An Animal Farm. I need a good
Tone deaf description of what it was they were trying to do. But I think that the thinking was that we're faced with an epidemic of hate crime, and it's only getting worse. And we have a public duty to protect the potential victims of this coming tsunami. And one way to help the police protect people will be to improve their intelligence about who's likely to commit these crimes. So we'll encourage the police, if they receive a hate crime report and they investigate it and conclude that the threshold for prosecuting the person hasn't been met, i.e. it's not a crime, not yet a crime, then they should record it in their database as a non-crime, and then keep an eye on these folks.
This is why London has the biggest knife
burglary, auto theft, all completely out of control. They're policing.
These rather insignificant things that
but I think
peripheral to police activity.
Yeah, and I think it's weird because in England and Wales alone, we think since this concept was first rolled out by the College of Policing in 2014, 10 years ago, we think over 250,000 non-crime hate incidents have been recorded, which, if you work it out, is roughly about 70 a day. And you
so I mean, the resources to go and fight, these dastardly activities, it must run into the millions and millions of pounds.
Little wonder they're not doing much about burglaries and auto theft and even knife crime. They're far too busy investigating people's tweets.
Yeah, I'm interested in a non-crime hate. What was it?
Non-crime hate incident.
Has that come out? I mean, the police can't just make up the laws ex nihilo. So it must. Has that come out of Parliament or what?
No.
They have made it up ex nihilo.
The College of Policing made it up, it was never a concept approved by Parliament until quite recently. We can get onto that. But one of the pernicious things about NCHIs is that for an incident to be recorded as a non-crime hate incident, the hate element has to be present, but there's no objective test of whether the hate element is present or not. It's entirely due to the perception, not just of the victim, quote unquote, but of any eyewitness, including the police officer investigating the crime or the alleged crime. So it's entirely subjective.
The non-crime.
As to essentially, they're speculating as to what was motivating the perpetrator to commit this non-crime, and if they decide that they were motivated by hatred of a particular protected group, and again they arbitrarily decided,
except for Jews,
without any parliamentary oversight, what groups were entitled to these protections and what groups weren't. But if the perception of the quote-unquote victim or a third party or the investigating officer was that the perpetrator was motivated by hostility towards the victim's protected characteristic or characteristics, then it could be recorded as an NCHI. And so Harry's comic verse was recorded as an NCHI, and he challenged both the College of Policing and Humberside Police in the High Court, and he won a partial victory. The court essentially decided, the High Court judge, that the Humberside Police were overreaching. They were behaving like the Stasi. He compared them to the Stasi. I think he even brought up 1984, but he didn't challenge the concept of NCHIs or the College of Policing's advice to police that they should be recording these, and their definition, which was incredibly capacious and subjective. And so Harry then challenged that ruling in the Court of Appeal and won again. And that coincided with the Free Speech Union managing to amend a bill going through Parliament to give the Home Secretary the option of bringing forward a statutory instrument to put the recording and retention of NCHIs on a statutory footing, introducing a statutory code of practice. So Parliament, for the first time, was going to have a say in this matter. And a new code of practice was, she did avail herself of that option, Suella Braverman, as she then was the Home Secretary, and a code of practice was introduced which does circumscribe, it doesn't eliminate NCHIs entirely, but it does limit the circumstances in which the police should record them and retain them on their databases. So it's still a problem, but it's less of a problem than it was. Right. Thanks in part to Harry Miller.
Go Harry. Just we unfortunately we have to finish. I could keep on chatting to you for hours. Your father was deeply involved in the Labour Party.
He was.
Yes. What would your father? Is it Michael?
Michael Young.
Yeah. Michael Young. That's right.
Yeah.
What would he think of the left now?
Well,
is it the same left that he worked with?
I think he was. He was. Soft left, a social democrat. He'd originally been a member of the Communist Party,
right,
but drifted rightwards from his kind of student days, and at one point left the Labour Party and joined the Social Democratic Party, which was a forerunner of what is now the Lib Dems in the UK. And they were a kind of soft left alternative to the Labour Party, and
sort of more centre,
more centrist, and almost replaced the Labour Party in the mid-80s. So I think he'd be as horrified by the illiberal authoritarianism of the radical progressive left as I am. And I think he would have been. I was involved in setting up some charter schools in England. From 2011 to 2014, and I think he would have approved of that. I mean, I'm sure there are many things about my politics he would have disapproved of, and we used to argue a lot when he was still alive. But I think one of the reasons I've kind of been left with this enduring love of free speech is I loved arguing with my father about these fundamental political differences. My idea of happiness is having a kind of alcohol-fueled kind of heated discussion that goes on late into the night about fundamental political differences. And that seems to me that's the kind of stuff of life. That's what gives life meaning and purpose. Kind of exploring and trying to work out what the kind of fundamental object of human life should be, and what a good society looks like, and what the limits of the state should be. All of those things that fascinate me, and I love debating those things, and I want other people to enjoy the same opportunities that I've enjoyed.
Yeah, well, I suffer from the same malady. I love all that stuff too. Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
To help The Shape of Dialogue grow, please subscribe, like and comment, and share it to all and sundry. Many thanks.